So I've put together a presentation that combines two of my favorite subjects, ecology and history, and it's going to let us do a little bit of time traveling. So we're going to go back as far as we have written records available, which will be the early 1700s, to get an idea of what some of the predominant vegetation types were in the Texas Hill Country prior to European settlement. And I know Dave has touched on it, but we're going to touch on it a little bit more. And we're going to look at how these have changed and how our perceptions have changed over the past 300 years. So I started compiling historic accounts for the Hill Country about 30 years ago. I was working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the early 1990s, and that was when I started hearing people say things like the Hill Country was originally dominated by grassland, Native Americans burned on a regular basis, and that Ashe juniper is not native and was brought in by the Spaniards. And I was also influenced by Del Winnegar's book. I had one of my coworkers gave that book to me, and I read that chapter, and that was also a big inspiration for this particular project. And I'll say my talk is normally 50 minutes. It's hard to get like that much history in 25 minutes. So I usually have a longer talk. So today I'm just going to be focusing on descriptions of the vegetation based on early European accounts. So here's an example of how prevalent the belief is that the Hill Country was originally dominated by grassland. This particular article uses historic accounts to justify land clearing practices, particularly of Ashe juniper. And in addition to the quote that's on the slide, I'm just going to let you guys read that. This article also states that, quote, when Frederick Law Olmsted crossed the Colorado River in 1857, he described the Hill Country region of central Texas as a vast region on which the live oak trees stand alone or in picturesque groups, near and far upon the green sward, which rolls in long waves. The first settlers found the landscape covered with little timber other than ancient cypress trees and some scattered sturdy oaks growing upon a carpet of lush grasses and herbs. So we'll go to the source and see what Frederick Law Olmsted and others actually said about the Hill Country vegetation. And today, as a land manager for the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, I'm particularly interested in historic accounts for the Austin area, since managing habitat for endangered and rare species begins with an understanding of how past events have influenced our present-day ecosystems. So Central Texas has been identified as biodiversity hotspots with many endemic and imperiled species. These are just some of the endangered and rare species within our preserves. So we have the golden-cheeked warbler, the black-capped vireo, cave invertebrates. The one shown on the slide is the tooth cave pseudoscorpion. We have aquatic salamanders. The one here is the Jollyville Plateau salamander, and rare plants. And we've got the bracted twist flower, that's the purple flower with the bee hovering above it, and canyon mock orange is the one with the white flowers. And all of these species depend on or occur in juniper oak ecosystems. So as I mentioned, I started working on this project about 30 years ago, and I've compiled accounts from over 20 observers, including missionaries, prospectors, settlers, scientists, and reporters. And the criteria for each account is similar to what Del Winnegar did, is that it must be from an eyewitness. So for example, we're looking at letters, diaries, reports, and publications that were written by the observer soon after the experience. Memoirs tend to be less accurate, as are secondhand accounts, so I did my best to exclude those. And my goal for the project is just to give these observers their own voice and allow them to speak for themselves. So I provide spatial and temporal context, including where each observer was with respect to major ecological regions, as well as timelines of some major historical events that you can see here on the slide that I've divided into 3 different time periods. And then during the latter part of the 1800s, other sources of information like maps and photos and field survey notes for the original land grants are available to corroborate the written accounts. So wherever possible, we want to cross-reference and piece together information from different sources to provide validation. And I always think of historical ecology as like putting together a puzzle. You've got to have as many pieces as possible, and they should all easily fit together. So it's important to look at multiple accounts and sources of information, and you're looking for common threads and consistency rather than focusing on a single account. And all of the pieces of the puzzle should easily fit together and make sense. So the first step is just to determine where each observer was with respect to major ecological regions, and particularly with respect to the Balcones Fault or the Balcones Escarpment. And that's shown here on the slide as the black and white dash line, which forms the eastern and the southern boundary of the Edwards Plateau and separates it from the Blackland Prairie. So the term hill country in my talk is referring to the hilly portions of the Edwards Plateau. So that's going to be the Balcones Canyonlands, as David was talking about. And then a little bit of the Llano uplift and a little bit of the cross timbers as well. But the main focus is going to be the Balcones Canyonlands. Austin, San Marcos, New Braunfels, and San Antonio were all settled on the Blackland Prairie side of the escarpment. And the respective counties, which would be Travis, Hayes, Comal, and Bear, lie along a major ecological divide, including both the Blackland Prairie and the Edwards Plateau ecoregions. And so these ecoregions support very different plant and animal communities. So again, it's really important to know, was your observer on the Blackland Prairie side or on the Edwards Plateau or the Balcones Canyonland side? So the first historic accounts I've been able to find were written in the early 1700s and are associated with early Spanish expeditions. And on each of these expeditions, someone with good navigational skills and observation was tasked with keeping a daily diary of the routes and the distances traveled. And these diaries are like a goldmine for historians because they also were required to report observations of their surroundings, including the flora and fauna that they encountered each day. So this is the first account that I could find of travel into the hill country beyond the Balcones Escarpment. So the map shows the approximate route for the entire expedition. Those are the red lines, and they're going from the Rio Grande up through Nacogdoches. And the location of present-day cities I included here as well, San Antonio, New Braunfels, and Nacogdoches. And then this particular account is near present-day New Braunfels, and the expedition is traveling up the Guadalupe River. So we'll read this together. We traveled upstream with a desire to ford the Guadalupe River or reach its source. We traveled about 3 leagues, which is roughly 8 miles, of very rugged land owing to the heavy woods and many rocks. And at the end of the 3 leagues, 2 soldiers left for upstream to reconnoiter the land. They said that it could not be traveled because it is more wooded and contains more rocks. The woods consist of oaks and junipers. And again, this is 1719. And this account is the first recorded European foray across the hill country. This observer traveled as part of an expedition from San Antonio north toward the area around San Saba to establish a mission and a presidio. And again, the red line is the approximate route. And this is 1756. Going past the Balcones Escarpment, we arrived at the river they call Balcones, which is the Guadalupe River. This was an effort because of the many hills and rocks, the many arroyos formed by the hills, and some thickets that contain valuable cedar and oak timbers. And there's other accounts of the vegetation along the same route, including the Blanco and the Pedernales rivers and the area in between that reported real similar observations. So our second time period, 1800 to 1850, we begin with Mexico's War for Independence from Spain, followed by Texas' War for Independence from Mexico. Houston and Lamar battle over the location of the Texas capital, and Lamar finally wins. And we end this time period with Texas becoming part of the United States. So the following excerpts are examples of written accounts during this time period. So this is an account that's actually along the edge of the Llano Uplift, and it's between the Llano Uplift and the Cross Timbers ecoregions. And again, the red line is the approximate route, the red circle is the approximate location of the observer, and then the Colorado River is shown here as well, just for reference. So 1830. As far as the eye could reach was one extended plain covered with verdure and beautiful flowers. And over it were riding numerous Indians driving caviards, which is an old folk term for a herd of horses. On the left hand of the valley rose a mountain to the height of 500 feet, covered with tall cedar trees. Never in my life have I seen so beautiful a landscape. On our right ran the clear waters of our own dear Colorado. Before us lay the beautiful valley, and on our left towered the high mountain of rock, covered with trees forever green and beautiful. And this observer is describing extensive grasslands. And again, red line, approximate route, red circle, approximate location, and he's on the Post Oak Savanna ecoregion and just about to enter the Blackland Prairie. And you have to keep reading for his description of the hill country. So 1839, immediately before us appeared as an extensive lawn with a beautiful green sward, slightly tinged with the various flowers which decked its surface. Not a shrub or bush obstructed the monotony of the towering live oak. Further to the west appeared the skirting timber, thickening the further it receded and rising gradually, so that mile after mile of dark boding forest rose to our view. And these are a couple of descriptions near New Braunfels. These are from Ferdinand Romer, a German geologist who spent over a year studying the geology of Texas from 1845 to 1846, and wrote extensive accounts of his travels. And he writes, "The cedar forest is a treasure to the colonists of New Braunfels, since the wood was preferred above all others on account of its durability when used in building houses and fences. The cedars here are not the stunted shrub-like plants found in the northern states of the Union, but are stately trees with straight trunks, seldom more than 20 to 25 feet in height and 1.5 feet thick. They have a uniformly spreading crown." So now we come to our third time period, 1850 to 1900, with the advent of the industrial age in Texas. So we have barbed wire patented in 1868, the first train arriving in Austin in 1871. We have the establishment of national parks, the opening of colleges, the completion of the Texas state capitol, and the discovery of oil. Major cattle drives start up with an estimated 20 million cattle driven from Texas to Kansas between 1866 and 1886. And the sheep and goat industry started up around the same time. And the human population in Texas increased from a little over 200,000 in 1850 to over 3 million by 1900, an increase of over 14 times the 1850 census, with the largest increase occurring after the Civil War. And by the end of the century, we've lost two of the most abundant species reported on our continent, the passenger pigeon and the American bison. And with all of that happening, with that as a backdrop, we've got examples that were occurring during that time period. So according to this observer, Ashe juniper was being cut for rail timber as far back as 1855, and remembering that the first train arrived in 1871, they would have been clearing prior to that. Again, red line, approximate route, circle, approximate location of the observer in what is today Williamson County. So 1855, we rode from Austin to the Brushy Creek, 20 miles, roughly near Cedar Park, and encamped for the night. The road was for about 14 miles of the way over a rich rolling prairie and for about 6 miles through a heavy cedar brake. Cedar is the main reliance for rail timber in this section, the live oak being too gnarled for such purposes. And then by the late 1880s, we have maps and photos that we can use to corroborate our written accounts. So this map of Austin, I'm just going to point out the artist's rendition of grass, which is flat with basically no texture, versus the woodland, which is textured. We're going to pair that up with a photo. This was taken from the Capitol Dome shortly after the Capitol was completed, around 1888, and they're looking southwest, so you can see the Colorado River in the background and then the hill country beyond that. And then I'm going to let you guys read the accounts and just see if all of that lines up. So now we come to the descriptions from Frederick Law Olmsted. Olmsted was a travel writer, a landscape architect, and a designer of urban parks, including Central Park in New York City. And we'll read what he wrote in 1857. Beyond San Marcos, our road approached closely the hill range, which is made up of spurs coming down from mountains north. They are well wooded with cedar and live oak. Behind us were the continuous wooded heights with a thick screen of cedars, and before us very beautiful prairies. So compare these descriptions from Olmsted's accounts with those in the article that I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation that concluded that the hill country was predominantly grassland and Ashe juniper is invasive. And his accounts actually describe the hills as being well wooded with a thick screen of cedars. And his account is consistent with this photo. This is a photo of San Marcos, which was taken around 1890. I'm going to talk faster. So note again, the town of San Marcos was settled on the Blackland Prairie, and the view behind is forested, so similar to what we see today. And here's a quote from the Austin Daily Democratic Statesman. This was the precursor to today's Austin American Statesman. And I'm just going to point out the juniper ties that you see in the photo. And we'll read this one. This is 1874. The cedar tie business has contributed largely to the growth and prosperity of the Hill City, which is Austin, in the last 2 years, more especially the last 12 months. A gentleman connected with the Central Railroad says that, and I'm going to emphasize this one, 200,000 cedar ties have been shipped from the city during the last 2 years. And when it is remembered that these ties bring from 60 to 90 cents each, the reader will readily comprehend the vastness of the revenue from this source. So my project ends with William Bray's publications in the early 1900s. William Bray was a forester, the first botany professor at the University of Texas, and wrote lengthy reports about the timber of the Edwards Plateau. He's got two from 1904 and then another one from 1906. And this is where we start to kind of get a hint of a shift in the perspective of hill country vegetation, with later reports describing the hill country as grasslands being invaded by woodlands. And you get a hint of that from Bray's reports, but just not quite as full-blown as what we see in later years and today. In 1904, he says the writer knows of no region in which any species of cedar is so uniformly abundant and dominant as is the mountain cedar in the limestone country of Texas. Mountain cedar is the most valuable tree of the semi-arid hill country of Texas. And then another excerpt from William Bray attempts to describe the extent of the woodlands. Another quote, "The data are not at hand to warrant even an approximate estimate of the area covered by cedar. The Colorado River breaks, one of the largest series, are almost continuous from Austin to the San Saba country. It's perhaps no exaggeration to estimate the area of these alone at 500 square miles." So cedar was so abundant, it supported a whole, if we want to call it a culture, of people dedicated to harvesting it. It was first used to make charcoal, and people were referred to as charcoal burners, and later for fence posts, railroad ties, telegraph poles, and all kinds of building materials. And it was such a big industry that an axe was created specifically for this purpose. This is the Kerrville Cedar Axe. And I'm not going to read this article. It's a really good article by Gene Holland from 1946. But I'll just note his reference to armies of cedar choppers swinging away for over 30 years. The size and intensity of fires appear to increase during the mid to late 1800s. Here's one example describing a fire near Marble Falls that burned about 600 acres. And here we have an account expressing concern about habitat for the golden-cheeked warbler going as far back as 1892. And this is Henry Atwater, who said, "Golden-cheeked warblers are nowhere abundant and only to be met within the thickest cedar breaks. And as these are fast being cut and burned out, the bird will no doubt become still more rare." And then just noting in the photo, there's a golden-cheeked warbler nest made of Ashe juniper bark. It's in an Ashe juniper tree, and golden-cheeked warblers nest exclusively in these Ashe juniper oak forests, and just one more piece of that puzzle. And I wanted to point out, too, that Ashe juniper wasn't the only tree that was harvested. Here's another account from William Bray that refers to the Texas, what we would call today the Texas red oak, and he refers to as the mountain Spanish oak. And a couple of other examples, cherry trees were used by pioneers for furniture, and bald cypress was used for a wide variety of wood products. And while William Bray described the Edwards Plateau as and he's referring to the entire Edwards Plateau as a, quote, "a timber country," he did point out, he was very careful to say that the timberland was not continuous and included scattered scrub timber and open grassland. Other observers also reported a mix of vegetation types, so while large portions of the hill country were heavily wooded, not all were, so it's important to also take a look at the more local scale. And just as an example, I'm going to show you a couple of photographs from William Bray's Timber of the Edwards Plateau report that are close to a couple of tracks on our Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, Wild Basin, and Vireo Preserve. And we'll start with an orientation for the location of the photos. So the slide shows a topo map of the West Bank Peninsula, which is just west of Austin. It's dated about 1895. And then you can see we've got Austin here, we have Mount Banal, we have Lake Austin, which was referred to as Lake McDonald back then. Bull Creek enters here. Loop 360 today would be going roughly here, and then Pennybacker Bridge would be somewhere right about there. And the most important thing here is Lone Tree Hill, which is just north of our preserves. So the first photo I'm going to show you, William Bray is standing on top of Lone Tree Hill, and he's looking out over what he calls the North Gorge. So he's here looking at this. And the next photo I'm going to show you is the South Gorge, which is here. So he's probably standing, I don't know, somewhere right about here, and he's looking with, you can see Lone Tree Hill in the background. All right, so here's William Bray's photo of the North Gorge, which he describes as having a, quote, almost impenetrable growth of cedar and mixed timber. And then this is William Bray's photo of the South Gorge. So you can see this is Lone Tree Hill in the background. And he describes this as having been cleared of most of the woody vegetation. So Bray spends a lot of time in his report comparing these two photos to illustrate the effects of forests on soils and the behavior of rainfall and runoff. He describes the heavily timbered Northern Gorge as having a deep layer of rich soil, and then in contrast, this Southern Gorge had been, quote, denuded down of soil down to the rock and adobe, and are never covered with more than a scanty growth of drought-enduring plants, which do not suffice to hide the white, arid slopes. And in his comparison of these two photos, Bray's making several points that forests build soil, forests protect soils from erosion and keep it cool and moist, and forest soils act as a sponge and promote recharge. And he concludes that, quote, for all these reasons, forests tend to conserve the water supply and maintain full springs and an even flow of streams. And he believed that the woodlands of the Edwards Plateau were critical to protecting water supplies downstream and advocated for their protection. And he actually was advocating that the state of Texas purchase large tracts of timber on the Edwards Plateau to protect water supplies. So just pointing this out again, just to say we have a very different perspective today, and also as the landscape changes, thinking about how our perceptions might change. And from a land manager's perspective, if our frame of reference is if this is what we've always known, we might manage very differently than if our frame of reference is the second photo. All right, so we're going to fast forward back to present day. This is a recent photo of the Vireo Preserve and Wild Basin, which is just, as I pointed out before, is south of Lone Tree Hill. Lone Tree Hill is now called Buckman Mountain and is covered with communication towers. So if you're looking out and you see like a bunch of radio towers out there, that's Lone Tree Hill. And if you look at the photo from present day, it kind of matches Bray's description of the Southern Gorge. So you can see there's a lot of bare caliche and bedrock. We have lost a lot of topsoil on the slopes, not only from clear cutting that William Bray described, but looking at historic aerial photographs, we know this area was clear cut again in the 1950s and burned in a really large fire in 1961. So without the benefit of Bray's descriptions and photos, we might just think, well, this is how it's always looked. And I've given previous presentations before, and I still have people who will say, but maybe that is a natural phenomenon. I mean, it does look like the geology could potentially, be supporting just kind of a scrubby slope. So it's important also just to get out on the land and walk it. So if you hike around on these slopes, you can see evidence that they were once forested. These are just a couple of photos of the many juniper stumps we can still see, and some of these are like really big. And I'm going to go over time. Juniper wood breaks down really slowly, and so where it's been left in place, it can last a really long time. And you can see like evidence of hatchet marks and burn scars. And because the slopes are steep, the soil washes off quickly and can take a long time for woody plants to get reestablished. And unfortunately, we've lost evidence of the hardwoods and other plants that would have been part of the forest since they break down really quickly compared to Ashe juniper. And just given all of that, I'm kind of providing a segue into our next talks. Just thinking about how these changes might have affected what we see today. As Bray noted, these forests help build and protect soil, and this is just a comparison of soil under a juniper motte on the steep slope that I just showed you in the photo before. And then underneath the adjacent area on the eroded slopes. So in this particular case, the organic matter under the juniper motte was over 5 times the amount of the bare area that didn't have any vegetation. And we found that organic matter continues to increase with forest stand age, and we've documented up to 24% in our older forests. And we often hear that nothing grows under cedar or under juniper, and so just thinking again with all of the historical information, is that due to the juniper, or could it have something to do with past land use and legacy effects like the loss of seed sources? So this is a photo of a juniper motte on the steep eroded slopes. Juniper is one of the few native plants that can grow in these harsh environments. And you can see here, because we actually do still have a good seed source nearby, but there's a variety of woody plants under the canopy. And in addition to organic matter, junipers provide protection from deer browse and shade. And we've conducted seedling survival studies of 3 different species of oaks, live oak, shin oak, and Texas red oak, and found that shade is absolutely critical to keeping the seedlings alive during summer drought. And we have really high mortality, almost complete mortality if we plant them under the open. And just pointing out too that juniper is both a pioneering species and a climax or late successional species. And then these are just some of the few examples of some of the amazing plants that grow under the juniper oak forests. So setting this up for Jason's talk next. And I'm just going to conclude with a quote on the relevance of historical ecology to informing land management decisions. All right, and because this is usually a longer presentation, and it was kind of hard to condense down to 25 minutes, and I don't know, what am I at, 27 maybe? If you want to see the longer version, there's also some other really good talks. We did a forest restoration series of video series back in the fall of 2020. So you can see the longer version of this talk, and then multiple other talks on forest restoration. And then if you like written form, I basically put the longer version of the PowerPoint into a report that we're going to make available when we upload the talks on the Biodiversity Works website. And that's it. All right. Thank you.
We do have a few minutes for some questions. Are there some questions in the audience? I think I need a roving microphone person.
Hi, Lisa. I'm curious, when you're reading these historical records, if we're able to parse out ash juniper from eastern red cedar.
Sorry, I had a hard time understanding.
Well, so, oftentimes or sometimes eastern red cedar can be mixed up with ash juniper, and they do grow larger, and I could imagine those being used for the railroad ties and whatnot.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so the observers weren't botanists, and ash juniper actually wasn't described until like 1930. So they just refer to it as cedar, mountain cedar, cedros, and the older accounts of the Spanish expeditions. So there isn't any way to know for sure, other than just the location. And there are some eastern red cedars in the hill country, but it's predominantly ash juniper. So, but it's potential that it could be either one.
Other questions?
Hi. So do you find that Del Winiger's book squares with your independent research, or do you think it's dated and needs a new perspective?
I'd actually like to see it in print again, because you can get copies, but they're really expensive. I use the same methodology. The difference is that he provides a lot of interpretation. So he has like a very interesting, very fun to read chapter. And I really wanted to just say, here's what I found, and let readers draw their own conclusions. So that's really the main difference.